In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Heights, what began as a routine complaint about noise from a construction site would unravel into a story of hidden heroism, devastating loss, and ultimate redemption that would shake the very foundations of this peaceful community. When decorated war veteran Marcus Thompson tried to voice his concerns about late-night construction disturbing his young daughter's sleep, he never could have imagined that his polite request would trigger a chain of events involving corruption, cover-ups, and a 3-year-old mystery that had haunted the entire town. The arrogant construction foreman who dismissed Marcus so cruelly had no idea he was speaking to a man whose military connections ran deeper than anyone could imagine, and whose quest for justice would ultimately expose a truth so shocking that it would change everything anyone thought they knew about the disappearance of little Emma Rodriguez. Before we dive into this incredible true story that will leave you speechless, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you find yourself gripped by this tale of courage and determination, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. Marcus Thompson stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the modest homes of Maplewood Heights, a neighborhood he had chosen specifically for its reputation as a safe haven for families. The coffee in his ceramic mug, decorated with the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, had long since grown cold as he stared at the construction site that had been plaguing his street for the past 6 months. The official permits claimed the work was for a new community center, but something about the operation had always felt off to Marcus, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him about it. The sound of small footsteps padding down the hallway broke his contemplation, and Marcus turned to see his 6-year-old daughter Sarah emerge from her bedroom, her curly hair tousled from sleep, and her favorite stuffed elephant clutched tightly in her arms. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of another restless night, disturbed by the inexplicable construction noise that seemed to occur at the most inappropriate hours, often continuing well past midnight despite city ordinances that clearly prohibited such activities. "Daddy, they were making those loud noises again," Sarah said, her voice small and tired as she climbed onto his lap. Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily as he wrapped his arms around his daughter, the protective instinct that had been honed by years of military service flaring to life. Since his wife Elena had passed away 2 years ago from cancer, Sarah had become the center of his universe, and seeing her suffer from sleep deprivation because of someone's blatant disregard for community rules filled him with a familiar burning sensation that he recognized from his deployment days. The construction site in question sat on what had once been the Rodriguez family's backyard, a property that had been hastily sold following one of the most tragic events in Maplewood Heights' recent history. 3 years ago, little Emma Rodriguez had vanished without a trace from that very backyard while playing during a family barbecue, disappearing in the span of minutes while her parents were inside preparing food. The extensive search that followed had involved the FBI, state police, and hundreds of volunteers, but despite their best efforts, Emma had never been found, and the case had eventually gone cold, leaving the Rodriguez family devastated and the entire community shaken. Marcus had been overseas during the initial search for Emma, serving his final tour of duty in Afghanistan, but he remembered the phone calls from Elena describing the fear that had gripped their neighborhood. When he finally returned home 6 months later, the Rodriguez house had already been sold, the family having moved away to escape the constant reminders of their loss. The property had sat empty for over a year before being purchased by Pinnacle Development Corporation, the same company that was now supposedly building a community center but seemed to be operating under circumstances that struck Marcus as highly irregular As a career military man with over 15 years of service, Marcus had developed an instinct for spotting operations that didn't pass the smell test. And everything about this construction project raised red flags in his mind. The workers arrived at odd hours, often in unmarked vehicles, and the nature of their work seemed far more extensive than what would be required for a simple community center. There had been nights when Marcus had observed heavy machinery operating under floodlights, digging far deeper than any foundation should require, and the amount of soil being removed and trucked away seemed excessive for the proposed structure. The foreman of the operation, a man named Jake Morrison, who drove an expensive pickup truck that seemed incongruous with typical construction work, had been dismissive and often openly hostile whenever any neighbors had attempted to voice concerns about the noise, dust, and general disruption the project was causing. Morrison's attitude had particularly grated on Marcus, who had spent years in leadership positions where respect for community and consideration for others were fundamental values that were never compromised. Marcus had initially tried to address his concerns through proper channels, contacting the city planning department and attempting to review the construction permits. But he had been met with bureaucratic runaround and vague assurances that everything was being conducted according to code. The phone calls to the non-emergency police line about noise violations had resulted in officers who seemed curiously reluctant to enforce the city's noise ordinances, often arriving hours after the disturbances had ended and showing little interest. In documenting the violations, Sarah's teacher had already contacted Marcus twice about her daughter's declining performance in school, noting that Sarah frequently appeared tired and had difficulty concentrating during lessons. The pediatrician had confirmed that the chronic sleep disruption was affecting Sarah's development and recommended that Marcus find a way to eliminate the source of the nighttime disturbances. For a single father trying to provide stability for his child after the loss of her mother, the construction noise represented more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to his daughter's well-being. The military had taught Marcus the importance of following the chain of command and exhausting official channels before taking more direct action, but his patience was rapidly wearing thin. He had filed formal complaints with the city council, documented the violations with photographs and sound recordings, and even attempted to engage with the construction company's corporate office. But each effort had been met with delays, excuses, and what appeared to be deliberate obstruction. What Marcus didn't know was that his methodical approach to addressing the situation had attracted attention from people who had significant investments in ensuring that the construction project continued without interference. His military background, his attention to detail, and his persistence in following proper procedures had made him a person of interest to individuals who had gone to great lengths to keep certain aspects of the Pinnacle development project hidden from public scrutiny. The morning sun climbed higher as Marcus prepared Sarah's breakfast and got her ready for school, but his mind kept returning to the decision he had made during the sleepless hours of the previous night. He had exhausted the official channels, and his daughter's health was suffering as a result of his inability to resolve the situation through proper means. Today, he would take a more direct approach and confront Jake Morrison face to face, demanding answers about the construction schedule and insisting on compliance with the city's noise ordinances. As Marcus walked Sarah to the school bus stop, he noticed Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down watering her garden, with an expression of obvious fatigue on her face. The elderly woman had been one of the most vocal critics of the construction project, and Marcus knew that she had been experiencing the same sleep disruptions that were affecting his household. The sight of her struggling with the heavy watering reminded Marcus that this wasn't just about his family. The entire neighborhood was suffering from the disruption, and someone needed to take a stand. After seeing Sarah safely onto the bus, Marcus returned to his house and retrieved his military service records and documentation of his complaints against the construction company. He had learned long ago that preparation was the key to successful confrontation, and he wanted to ensure that Jake Morrison understood exactly who he was dealing with when they had their conversation. Marcus had no way of knowing that this decision to confront the construction foreman would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately expose a conspiracy involving city officials, uncover evidence of a crime that had haunted the community for 3 years, and put his own life in danger. The folder containing his documentation felt heavy in Marcus's hands as he reviewed the timeline of events, the photographs of excessive excavation, and the sound recordings that clearly demonstrated violations of city noise ordinances. He had approached this situation with the same methodical precision that had served him well during his military career, building a case that any reasonable person would find compelling. What he hadn't anticipated was that the people behind the construction project had no intention of being reasonable, and that his quest for answers would lead him into a confrontation with forces far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Marcus prepared to leave for the construction site. He caught sight of the framed photograph on his mantelpiece showing Eleanor holding baby Sarah in the hospital, both of them smiling with the joy of new parenthood. The image reminded him of his responsibility to protect his daughter and provide her with the stable, peaceful home environment that Elena had always envisioned for their family. This wasn't just about noise violations or construction permits. It was about preserving the kind of community where children could grow up safely, where families could find peace, and where neighbors looked out for one another. Marcus Thompson adjusted the rearview mirror of his weathered Ford pickup truck as he pulled into the parking area near the construction site, taking a moment to observe the scene before him with the tactical awareness that had become second nature during his years of military service. The construction zone sprawled across what had once been a well-maintained residential lot, now transformed into a maze of heavy machinery, temporary fencing, and excavated earth that seemed far more extensive than any community center project should require. The morning air carried the acrid smell of diesel fuel and disturbed soil, a combination that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of some of the forward operating bases he had known in Afghanistan. The man who emerged from the construction trailer parked at the edge of the site was immediately recognizable as Jake Morrison, the foreman whose dismissive attitude toward neighborhood complaints had become legendary among the residents of Maplewood Heights. Morrison was a large man in his early 40s, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been physically imposing, but had allowed middle age and comfortable living to soften his edges. His expensive work boots had never seen real construction. Work, Marcus noticed immediately, and the gold watch on his wrist was worth more than most construction workers made in several months. Everything about Morrison's appearance suggested a man who was playing a role rather than actually performing the job he claimed to hold. Morrison's attention was focused on his smartphone as he emerged from the trailer, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen in what appeared to be an urgent text conversation. The expression on his face was one of irritation, mixed with something that Marcus recognized as anxiety, though the source of that concern wasn't immediately apparent. When Morrison finally looked up and noticed Marcus standing near the construction fence, his demeanor shifted instantly to one of aggressive defensiveness, as if the mere presence of a concerned neighbor represented some kind of threat to his operation. "This is a restricted construction zone," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the kind of forced authority that Marcus had learned to recognize in people who had been given power without earning the respect that should come with it. "You need to move along before someone gets hurt." The threat implicit in Morrison's words was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had grown accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. But Marcus had faced down insurgents in combat zones and wasn't easily impressed by bluster from civilian bullies. Marcus approached the fence slowly and deliberately, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, despite the anger that was building inside him as he took in the full scope of the construction operation. The excavation work was far more extensive than anything that should be required for a community center, with trenches and holes that suggested they were either installing massive underground utilities or searching for something that was buried, considerably deeper than normal building foundations would require. The amount of heavy machinery on site was also excessive for the stated purpose of the project, including specialized excavation equipment that Marcus recognized from his military engineering training as being designed for deep soil displacement. Rather than standard construction work, I'm Marcus Thompson, and I live 3 blocks from here, Marcus said, his voice calm and measured despite the frustration that had been building for months. My 6-year-old daughter hasn't had a full night's sleep in weeks because of the noise from this site, and I'm here to discuss the construction schedule and see if we can find a way to minimize the disruption to the neighborhood, especially during the hours when children should be sleeping. Marcus had chosen his words carefully, presenting his request as a reasonable accommodation rather than a demand, hoping to establish some common ground that might lead to a productive conversation. Morrison's response was immediate and contemptuous, his expression shifting to one of undisguised disdain as he looked Marcus up and down, taking in the modest clothing and older pickup truck that suggested a man of limited financial means. Listen, pal, I've got a job to do here, and I don't have time to hold hands with every neighbor who thinks the world revolves around their personal convenience. Construction is noisy. That's the nature of the business. If you don't like it, maybe you should have thought about that before buying a house in a developing area. The dismissive tone and casual cruelty of Morrison's response triggered something deep inside Marcus, a protective fury that he had learned to control during his military service, but which threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. This wasn't just about noise or inconvenience. This was about respect for community, consideration for families, and the basic human decency that seemed to be completely absent from Morrison's worldview. Marcus had spent years fighting to protect communities like Maplewood Heights, and the idea that someone could show such blatant disregard for the well-being of children and families struck him as a personal affront to everything he had sacrificed to defend. I understand that construction involves noise, Marcus replied, his military training helping him maintain control despite the provocation. But city ordinances require that disruptive construction activities be limited to reasonable hours, typically between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening on weekdays. The work that's been happening here has continued well past midnight on several occasions, and my documentation shows that these violations have occurred at least 3 times per week for the past month. Marcus pulled out his folder of photographs and sound recordings, hoping that concrete evidence might penetrate Morrison's wall of indifference. Morrison glanced at the documentation with the kind of theatrical disinterest that suggested he was accustomed to dismissing legitimate complaints without serious consideration. "Your documentation doesn't mean anything to me," he said, his voice rising with aggressive impatience. "I've got permits from the city that allow me to work whatever hours are necessary to complete this project on schedule. If you've got problems with that, take it up with City Hall, not with me." The foreman's response was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed himself to be protected by higher authorities, though Marcus couldn't help but notice the slight tension in Morrison's voice that suggested he wasn't as secure in his position as he wanted to appear. The mention of city permits that allegedly authorized nighttime construction raised immediate red flags in Marcus's mind, since his previous inquiries with the planning department had yielded no evidence of any such special authorizations. Either Morrison was lying about the permits, or there were aspects of this project that were being deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. Marcus's military intelligence training had taught him to recognize when official channels were being manipulated to hide unauthorized activities, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that something about this construction project was fundamentally wrong. "I'd be happy to review those permits," Marcus said, his tone remaining professional despite his growing suspicion. "Could you provide me with the permit numbers so I can verify them with the city planning office?" The request was perfectly reasonable, but Morrison's immediate defensive reaction suggested that producing the permits might be more complicated than it should be for a legitimate construction project operating under proper authorization. Morrison's face flushed with anger at the implied challenge to his authority, and his response carried the kind of barely controlled rage that Marcus associated with people who were hiding something significant. "I don't have to prove anything to you, soldier boy. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Get off my site before I call the police and have you arrested." The reference to Marcus's military service was delivered with sneering contempt, as if Morrison viewed veterans as somehow inferior to successful businessmen like himself. The insult struck Marcus harder than he had expected, not because he was ashamed of his military service, but because it represented the same kind of casual disrespect for sacrifice and service that he had encountered from certain types of people throughout his civilian transition. Marcus had spent 15 years defending the freedoms that allowed people like Morrison to build their businesses and accumulate their wealth, and the suggestion that this service somehow made him less worthy of respect was profoundly offensive, on a level that transcended the immediate dispute about construction noise. Marcus looked past Morrison toward the excavation area, where several workers were operating heavy machinery with what appeared to be unusual urgency for a routine construction project. The workers themselves seemed nervous and kept glancing toward the trailer where Morrison had emerged, as if they were waiting for instructions or watching for some kind of signal. The entire operation had the feel of something that was being conducted under pressure, with deadlines that were driven by factors other than normal construction scheduling concerns. "This conversation isn't over," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of military leadership. "My daughter deserves to sleep peacefully in her own home, and this community deserves to have construction projects conducted according to legal standards. I'll be pursuing this matter through appropriate channels, and I expect you'll be hearing from city officials about compliance with noise ordinances and permit requirements." Marcus turned to leave, but Morrison's parting words stopped him in his tracks. "You military types are all the same," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the construction site with deliberate loudness. "You think your service entitles you to special treatment, but out here in the real world, nobody cares about your medals or your sob stories. You're just another complainer who can't mind his own business." The words were calculated to provoke a response, and Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily as he fought the urge to return and show Morrison exactly what kind of response his military training had prepared him to deliver. Instead, Marcus continued walking toward his truck, his mind already working on the next steps in his campaign to address the construction violations. He had faced down far more dangerous enemies than Jake Morrison, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by a civilian bully who had probably never faced real adversity in his comfortable life. What Morrison didn't know was that Marcus's military service had connected him with a network of people who took violations of community standards very seriously, and that his methodical approach to problem-solving had uncovered discrepancies in the construction project that went far beyond simple noise violations. As Marcus drove away from the construction site, he couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Morrison had been about more than just noise complaints and permit violations. There had been something in the foreman's eyes, a kind of desperate anxiety that suggested he was under pressure from sources that Marcus hadn't yet identified. The excessive security around the construction site, the unusual excavation patterns, and Morrison's extreme defensiveness all pointed to a project that was hiding something significant from public view. What Marcus didn't know was that his military background and his persistent inquiries about the construction project had already brought him to the attention of people who had invested considerable resources in ensuring that certain secrets remained buried. His confrontation with Morrison had been observed and reported to individuals who viewed Marcus's questions as a potential threat to operations that extended far beyond the construction of a simple community center. The wheels of a much larger conspiracy were already in motion, and Marcus's determination to protect his daughter's well-being was about to put him in the crosshairs of forces he couldn't yet imagine. Part 3. The antagonist and their world. Jake Morrison watched Marcus Thompson's pickup truck disappear around the corner before pulling out his encrypted smartphone and dialing a number he had memorized but hoped he would never need to use. The phone rang twice before a cold, professional voice answered with nothing more than a simple report. Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to find the right words to explain how a simple neighborhood complaint had suddenly become a potential threat to an operation worth millions of dollars. "We've got a problem," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced around the construction site to ensure none of his workers were within earshot. "That veteran I told you about, Thompson, he just confronted me directly. He's got documentation, photographs, sound recordings. This guy isn't just some random complainer. He's building a case, and he's got the kind of military background that means he knows how to ask the right questions." Morrison paused, waiting for a response that didn't come immediately, the silence on the other end of the line more intimidating than any threat could have been. The voice that finally responded belonged to Vincent Castellano, a man whose business empire encompassed legitimate construction contracts, strategic political relationships, and considerably less legitimate activities that generated the kind of profits that allowed him to live in a mansion overlooking the city while maintaining the public facade of a respected businessman and philanthropist. Castellano had built his fortune by understanding that every problem could be solved with the right combination of money, influence, and carefully applied pressure. But he had not anticipated that a decorated war veteran with time on his hands and a sick child would pose a significant threat to his most sensitive ongoing operation. "How much does he know?" Castellano asked, his tone suggesting that Morrison's answer would determine not just the foreman's future employment prospects, but potentially his continued good health. Castellano had not reached his current position by leaving loose ends untied, and the Maplewood Heights project represented the culmination of 3 years of careful planning, strategic property acquisition, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might interfere with the recovery of assets that were worth far more than the community center that served as cover for the real excavation work. Morrison struggled to control his voice as he tried to explain the extent of Thompson's knowledge without revealing the full scope of his own incompetence in handling the situation. He knows about the night work, the noise violations, the fact that our excavation goes deeper than any community center should require. He's been documenting everything, and he's asking about permits that we can't produce because they don't exist in the form we claim they do. But the real problem is that he's not backing down. This guy has the kind of military bearing that suggests he's used to fighting battles that matter to him. The construction project at Maplewood Heights had originally been conceived as a straightforward real estate development opportunity, but it had evolved into something far more complex when Castellano's research into the property's history had revealed information that transformed a routine investment into a treasure hunt worth tens of millions of dollars. The Rodriguez family, who had owned the property before their daughter's disappearance, had unknowingly been sitting on a piece of land that contained something far more valuable than they could have imagined, something that had been buried decades earlier by people who had intended to return for it, but had been prevented by circumstances beyond their control. Castellano's organization had spent considerable resources investigating the history of the Maplewood Heights neighborhood, tracking down property records, interviewing long-time residents, and piecing together a puzzle that dated back to the 1970s, when the area had been used as a temporary storage location for assets that were being moved out of the country during a federal investigation into organized crime activities. The families who had originally buried the assets had been arrested, imprisoned, or killed before they could retrieve their hidden wealth, leaving behind a fortune that had remained undisturbed for nearly 5 decades. The disappearance of Emma Rodriguez had been an unexpected complication that had initially threatened to derail the entire operation, since the massive police investigation and media attention had made it impossible to begin excavation work while the case remained active. Castellano had been forced to wait nearly 2 years before the investigation cooled sufficiently to allow him to approach the grieving Rodriguez family with an offer to purchase their property at above market value, presenting himself as a developer who wanted to honor their daughter's memory by building a community center that would serve local families. The Rodriguez family's decision to sell the property and move away from the neighborhood had been exactly what Castellano needed to begin the real work of locating and recovering the buried assets, but the project had proven more challenging than anticipated. The original burial sites had been marked using reference points that had changed over the decades, requiring extensive excavation work that had to be conducted under the cover of legitimate construction activities while avoiding attention from neighbors, city officials, and law enforcement agencies that might become curious about the true nature of the operation. Morrison had been selected as the project foreman not because of his construction expertise, which was minimal, but because of his willingness to follow orders without asking questions, and his ability to manage the legitimate construction workers who provided cover for the specialized excavation teams that conducted the real work during nighttime hours when their activities were less likely to be observed. The foreman's job was to maintain the illusion of a normal construction project while ensuring that the excavation work proceeded according to Castellano's carefully planned schedule. The financial stakes involved in the Maplewood Heights project were enormous, with preliminary estimates suggesting that the recovered assets could be worth anywhere from $20 to $50 million, depending on current market values for the precious metals, rare coins, and negotiable securities that had been buried by their original owners. Castellano had already invested significant resources in acquiring the property, obtaining fraudulent permits, bribing city officials, and assembling the specialized team required to locate and recover assets that had been deliberately concealed, using methods designed to prevent their discovery by law enforcement agencies. The success of the Maplewood Heights operation would establish Castellano as a major player in the recovery and redistribution of assets that had been hidden by organized crime families during federal crackdowns that had occurred throughout the previous century. Intelligence gathered by his organization suggested that dozens of similar burial sites existed throughout the region, representing a virtually untapped source of wealth that could be recovered by individuals with the resources, connections, and ruthlessness required to conduct such operations without attracting unwanted attention. Morrison's failure to effectively manage neighborhood complaints represented more than just a public relations problem. It threatened to expose an operation that had already cost Castellano millions of dollars and had involved the corruption of city officials whose continued cooperation was essential to the success of similar projects throughout the region. The foreman's inability to intimidate a single concerned father suggested a fundamental weakness in the project's security arrangements that could potentially compromise the entire operation if not addressed immediately and decisively. "I want everything you have on this Thompson character," Castellano said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that Morrison had learned to fear over the months of their association. "Military records, financial information, family background, employment history, medical records if you can get them. I want to know everything about his life, his weaknesses, his pressure points, and the people he cares about. If he's going to be a problem, we need to understand exactly what kind of problem he represents and how best to neutralize that threat." The resources available to Castellano's organization for gathering intelligence on potential threats were considerable, including corrupt law enforcement officers, private investigators, computer specialists, and individuals with access to government databases that were supposed to be secure from unauthorized inquiries. Within hours of Morrison's phone call, a comprehensive dossier on Marcus Thompson would be compiled, containing information about his military service, his wife's death, his financial struggles as a single father, and any other details that might be useful in determining how best to discourage his continued interest in the construction project. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he considered the implications of Castellano's instructions, since he had worked for the organization long enough to understand that neutralizing threats could involve methods ranging from financial pressure and legal harassment to considerably more permanent solutions. The foreman had originally been attracted to his current position by the generous compensation and the promise of easy work, but he was beginning to realize that his association with Castellano's organization had drawn him into activities that were far more dangerous than he had initially understood. "What if he goes to the police or the media?" Morrison asked, his voice betraying the anxiety that had been building since his confrontation with Thompson. "This guy has the kind of military background that means people will take him seriously. And if he starts talking about permit violations and excavation irregularities, we could have investigators crawling all over this site within days." The foreman's concerns were legitimate, since the Maplewood Heights project depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate construction activities while conducting excavation work that would not withstand serious scrutiny from qualified inspectors. Castellano's response carried the kind of confidence that came from years of successfully managing similar challenges through the strategic application of influence, intimidation, and, when necessary, more direct forms of persuasion. "Let me worry about the police and the media. I've got enough people in the right places to ensure that any complaints from your veteran friend get buried in bureaucratic delays and jurisdictional disputes. But I need you to understand that this project is too important to be derailed by one persistent neighbor, regardless of his military background or his sob story about his sick daughter." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes as Castellano outlined the steps that would be taken to address the Thompson problem, including surveillance of his daily activities, investigation of his financial situation, and the preparation of contingency plans that could be implemented if less aggressive methods proved insufficient to discourage his continued interference. Morrison listened with growing unease as he began to understand the full extent of the forces that were being mobilized to deal with a man whose only crime had been asking reasonable questions about a construction project that was disrupting his neighborhood. As Morrison ended the call and returned to supervising the legitimate construction workers who provided cover for the real excavation activities, he couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Marcus Thompson had set in motion events that would ultimately destroy lives and tear apart a community that had already suffered more than its share of tragedy. The foreman had signed on to manage a construction project, but he was beginning to realize that he had become an unwilling participant in something far more sinister than he had ever imagined possible. Marcus Thompson sat in his kitchen that evening. Spread before him on the worn wooden table were photographs, sound recordings, permit applications, and a growing collection of documents that painted a disturbing picture of the construction project that had been disrupting his neighborhood for months. The confrontation with Jake Morrison earlier that day had only strengthened his resolve to get to the bottom of what was really happening at the former Rodriguez property. And the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the official story about building a community center was nothing more than an elaborate cover for something far more sinister. Sarah had fallen asleep early, exhausted from another night of broken sleep caused by the mysterious construction noise that seemed to occur with increasing frequency, despite Morrison's claims that all work was being conducted according to proper permits and city regulations. Marcus had spent the afternoon making phone calls to various city departments, trying to verify the permits that Morrison had claimed authorized the nighttime construction activities. But every inquiry had been met with delays, conflicting information, and bureaucratic runaround that suggested someone was working very hard to keep the details of the project hidden from public scrutiny. The sound of his doorbell ringing at nearly 9 o'clock in the evening surprised Marcus, since he rarely received unexpected visitors, especially at such a late hour. Through the front window, he could see a sleek black sedan parked in his driveway, the kind of expensive vehicle that looked distinctly out of place in his modest neighborhood. Two men in dark suits stood on his front porch, their professional appearance and serious demeanor immediately triggering the kind of heightened awareness that Marcus had developed during his military service when faced with potentially dangerous situations. Marcus opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain engaged as he assessed the visitors who had arrived unannounced at his home. The older of the two men appeared to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothing that suggested significant financial resources, while his companion was younger and had the alert, watchful posture that Marcus recognized as characteristic of professional security personnel or law enforcement officers. Neither man smiled or offered any explanation for their presence, creating an atmosphere of tension that immediately put Marcus on guard. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Vincent Castellano, and this is my associate, Mr. Rodriguez," the older man said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and implied authority. "I understand you've been having some concerns about the construction project in your neighborhood, and I thought it might be helpful if we could have a conversation about how to address those issues in a way that works for everyone involved." The mention of the Rodriguez name sent a chill through Marcus, since he knew that was the surname of the family whose daughter had disappeared from the very property where the construction was now taking place. Marcus studied the two men carefully, noting details that his military training had taught him to observe when assessing potential threats. Castellano's expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested someone with significant resources and influence, while his companion's alert posture and the slight bulge under his jacket indicated he was almost certainly armed. The timing of their visit, coming just hours after his confrontation with Morrison, suggested that his inquiries about the construction project had attracted attention from people who were far more powerful and potentially dangerous than a simple construction foreman. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral as he tried to assess the situation and determine the best way to handle what was clearly a veiled threat disguised as a friendly visit. "I've filed legitimate complaints about noise violations and permit irregularities through proper channels, and I expect those issues to be addressed according to established procedures. I don't see how a private conversation would be appropriate under these circumstances." Marcus's military training had taught him the importance of establishing clear boundaries when dealing with individuals who might be attempting to circumvent official processes through intimidation or corruption. Castellano's smile never wavered, but Marcus noticed a slight hardening around his eyes that suggested the man was not accustomed to having his offers of conversation declined by people he considered to be beneath his social and economic status. "Mr. Thompson, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our visit. I'm here as a concerned member of the community who wants to ensure that hard-working families like yours aren't unnecessarily inconvenienced by development projects that ultimately benefit everyone in the neighborhood. Perhaps if you understood the full scope of what we're trying to accomplish, you might see things from a different perspective." The suggestion that Marcus was somehow misunderstanding the situation because he lacked sufficient information was clearly intended to provoke him into engaging in a conversation that would allow Castellano to assess how much he actually knew about the construction project and what it might take to discourage his continued inquiries. Marcus had encountered similar tactics during his military intelligence work, where hostile actors would often attempt to gather information by presenting themselves as helpful sources of clarification about supposedly misunderstood situations. "The only thing I need to understand is why construction work is being conducted in violation of city noise ordinances. Why the excavation appears to be far more extensive than what would be required for a community center, and why the permits that supposedly authorize this work can't be verified through normal city channels," Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger as he outlined the specific concerns that had motivated his investigation. "Those are factual questions that should have straightforward answers, and I don't see how a private conversation would be more appropriate than addressing them through official channels." The mention of permit verification and excavation irregularities caused a barely perceptible change in Castellano's expression, a momentary tightening around his eyes that confirmed Marcus's suspicion that his inquiries had touched on sensitive aspects of the construction project that were being deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. The reaction was subtle, but Marcus had been trained to recognize the kind of micro-expressions that indicated when someone was being confronted with information they didn't want to discuss. Castellano's companion, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, took a small step closer to the door, his movement calculated to be just subtle enough to avoid appearing overtly threatening while still conveying the message that Marcus's continued resistance to their visit might have unpleasant consequences. The gesture was professional and practiced, suggesting someone with extensive experience in using implied physical intimidation to influence the outcome of negotiations that weren't proceeding. "According to plan, Mr. Thompson, I understand that you're a veteran, and I have tremendous respect for your service to our country," Castellano continued, his tone becoming more formal and less friendly as he realized that his initial approach wasn't producing the desired results. But sometimes civilian life requires a different kind of thinking than what might have served you well in the military. In the business world, there are often complexities and relationships that aren't immediately apparent to outsiders, and getting involved in situations you don't fully understand can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. The shift from friendly Concern to veiled threat was exactly what Marcus had expected, based on his assessment of the two men and their obvious connection to the construction project that had been the focus of his investigation. The reference to unintended consequences was clearly meant to suggest that continued interference with the construction project might result in problems for Marcus or his family, a threat that immediately triggered the protective instincts that had been honed by years of military service in dangerous environments. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus asked directly, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that had served him well during his military career when faced with individuals who mistook courtesy for weakness. "Because if you are, I think this conversation is over, and I'll be documenting this visit as part of my ongoing investigation into the irregularities surrounding the construction project in question." Marcus's hand moved toward his pocket where his smartphone was located, a gesture that suggested he was prepared to record any further conversation for use as evidence if the situation continued to escalate. Castellano raised his hands in a gesture of mock innocence, his expression suggesting wounded surprise at the implication that his visit might be construed as threatening rather than helpful. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're misinterpreting my words. I'm simply trying to help you understand that sometimes community development projects involve complexities that aren't immediately apparent to residents who understandably focus on their immediate concerns rather than the broader picture. I'm here to offer information that might help you see the situation from a different perspective." The continued insistence that Marcus was somehow misunderstanding the situation because he lacked access to information that would clarify everything was clearly designed to provoke him into asking questions that would reveal how much he actually knew about the construction project and what specific aspects of the operation had attracted his attention. Marcus recognized the technique as a classic intelligence-gathering approach, where the interrogator presents themselves as helpful while actually fishing for information about what the subject knows or suspects. "The only information I need is publicly available through proper channels," Marcus replied firmly. "Construction permits, environmental impact assessments, noise ordinance compliance documentation, and excavation depth specifications should all be matters of public record. If there are complexities that justify violations of established regulations, then those complexities should be documented through official processes, not explained through private conversations with people who show up at my house unannounced after business hours." Marcus's refusal to engage with their attempt to gather information while simultaneously demonstrating his knowledge of the specific regulatory issues that should govern the construction project clearly frustrated both visitors, though they attempted to maintain their professional demeanor despite the obvious failure of their initial approach. Castellano's companion shifted his weight slightly, a movement that suggested growing impatience with the diplomatic approach and a preference for more direct methods of persuasion. "Mr. Thompson, I can see that you're a man of principle, and I respect that quality even when it makes our conversation more challenging than it might otherwise be," Castellano said, his tone becoming noticeably cooler as he prepared to abandon the pretense of friendly cooperation. "But I hope you'll consider the potential impact of your actions on your family, particularly your young daughter, who has already lost her mother and depends on you for stability and security. Sometimes the pursuit of principle can lead to consequences that affect the people we care about most, and those consequences aren't always what we intended or expected when we began our investigation." The direct reference to Sarah and Elena represented a clear escalation from implied threat to explicit intimidation, confirming Marcus's assessment that these men were far more dangerous than they had initially appeared, and that his investigation into the construction project had attracted attention from people who were willing to use threats against his family to discourage his continued inquiries. The mention of his wife's death was particularly calculated to provoke an emotional response, while demonstrating that they had conducted research into his personal background and vulnerabilities. Marcus felt his military training take over as he processed the direct threat to his daughter and began calculating the best response to a situation that had suddenly become far more serious than a simple neighborhood dispute about construction noise. These men had done their homework, knew about his family situation, and were prepared to use that knowledge as leverage to stop his investigation into whatever was really happening at the former Rodriguez property. "I think it's time for you to leave," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was preparing for the possibility that the conversation might escalate beyond verbal threats. "And if you or anyone associated with you comes near my daughter or my home again, you'll discover that my military training involved considerably more than just following orders and asking polite questions about permit irregularities." Part 5. The Aftermath and Hidden Consequences. The black sedan pulled away from Marcus Thompson's driveway with deliberate slowness, its occupants having delivered their message with the kind of professional efficiency that left no doubt about the seriousness of their intentions. Marcus stood at his front window, watching the vehicle disappear into the darkness while his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. The visit from Castellano and his associate had transformed what he had initially viewed as a neighborhood nuisance into something far more dangerous, and the direct threats against his family had triggered every protective instinct that had been honed during his years of military service in hostile environments. Sarah remained peacefully asleep in her bedroom, blissfully unaware that her father's investigation into construction noise had attracted the attention of people who were willing to threaten a 6-year-old child to protect whatever secrets were buried beneath the former Rodriguez property. Marcus checked the locks on all doors and windows, activated the security system that he had installed after Elena's death, and positioned himself where he could observe the street, while considering his next moves in a situation that had suddenly become far more complex and potentially lethal than he had ever imagined. The documents spread across his kitchen table now seemed to represent more than just evidence of permit violations and noise ordinance infractions. They had become pieces of a puzzle that apparently connected to criminal activities serious enough to justify threats against military veterans and their families. Marcus began photographing each document with his smartphone, uploading the images to a secure cloud storage account that he had established during his transition from military to civilian life, ensuring that his research would be preserved even if something happened to the physical evidence or to him personally. The mention of the Rodriguez name during Castellano's visit had been particularly disturbing, since Marcus knew that the family had lost their daughter Emma 3 years earlier, from the very property where the suspicious construction work was now taking place. The timing seemed too coincidental to be random, and Marcus found himself wondering whether there might be connections between Emma's disappearance and the current excavation activities that were being conducted under the cover of community center construction. His laptop computer hummed quietly as Marcus began conducting online searches for information about Vincent Castellano, using techniques he had learned during his military intelligence training to trace connections between individuals, businesses, and activities that might not be immediately apparent through casual investigation. The initial results were disturbing, revealing a pattern of business dealings that involved construction companies, real estate development, and political relationships that suggested Castellano operated at the intersection of legitimate business and considerably less legitimate activities. The corporate structure surrounding the Maplewood Heights construction project proved to be labyrinthine in its complexity, with multiple shell companies, offshore partnerships, and financial arrangements that seemed designed to obscure the true ownership and funding sources for the development. Marcus's military experience with investigating insurgent financing networks had taught him to recognize the kind of deliberate obfuscation that was typically employed by organizations with something significant to hide from law enforcement scrutiny. Public. Record searches revealed that Castellano had been investigated by federal authorities on multiple occasions, though charges had never been filed due to what appeared to be insufficient evidence or procedural irregularities that had compromised the investigations. The pattern suggested someone with sufficient resources and connections to avoid prosecution, despite being involved in activities that attracted law enforcement attention. A profile that matched Marcus's assessment of the man who had threatened his family just hours earlier. The excavation work at the construction site had intensified dramatically in the days following Marcus's confrontation with Morrison, with heavy machinery operating around the clock and security measures that seemed excessive for a routine community development project. Neighbors reported seeing armed guards patrolling the perimeter of the construction zone during nighttime hours, and the level of activity suggested that whatever they were searching for was either very valuable or very incriminating, possibly both. Marcus's attempts to document the increased construction activity through photographs and video recordings had been hampered by the new security arrangements, but he had managed to capture images that showed excavation work extending far deeper than any community center foundation should require. The systematic nature of the digging suggested they were searching for something specific rather than simply preparing building foundations, and the urgency of their activities indicated they were operating under time pressure that went beyond normal construction scheduling concerns. The sound of his telephone ringing at nearly midnight startled Marcus from his research, and he hesitated before answering, uncertain whether the late-night call might be connected to his confrontation with Castellano's representatives. The voice on the other end belonged to his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down and had been one of the most vocal critics of the construction project's impact on the neighborhood's peace and quiet. "Marcus, I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm frightened," Mrs. Chen said, her voice trembling with anxiety that was clearly genuine. "There are men watching my house from a car parked across the street, and they've been there for hours. I think it might be connected to our complaints about the construction noise, because they arrived shortly after I saw that fancy car leave your driveway earlier this evening." The confirmation that Castellano's people were conducting surveillance of other neighbors who had complained about the construction project indicated that Marcus's investigation had triggered a broader campaign of intimidation designed to discourage any further community resistance to their activities. Marcus advised Mrs. Chen to call the police and document the surveillance, though he suspected that Castellano's organization had sufficient influence within local law enforcement to ensure that such complaints would be treated as low-priority nuisance calls rather than serious security concerns. The systematic nature of the intimidation campaign suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond what would be justified by a simple construction project, even one that involved permit violations and noise ordinance infractions. The implications of what Marcus had discovered were staggering in their scope and potential consequences for the entire Maplewood Heights community. If his suspicions were correct, the construction project was serving as cover for activities that could potentially involve organized crime, political corruption, and connections to the unsolved disappearance of Emma Rodriguez. The threats against his family indicated that powerful people had significant investments in ensuring that their activities remained hidden from public scrutiny and law enforcement investigation. Marcus's military training had taught him that intelligence gathering was only valuable if it could be acted upon through appropriate channels, but his experience with Vincent Castellano had demonstrated that the normal channels for addressing community concerns had been compromised by corruption or intimidation. City officials, who should have been enforcing permit requirements and noise ordinances, were either unwilling or unable to take action against Castellano's organization, suggesting that the problem extended far beyond the construction site itself. The decision Marcus faced was whether to continue his investigation at the risk of escalating the threats against his family, or to abandon his pursuit of the truth and allow whatever was happening at the former Rodriguez property to continue without interference. His military oath had included a commitment to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and the corruption that was enabling Castellano's activities represented exactly the kind of domestic threat that undermined the foundations of the community he had sworn to protect. Sarah's peaceful sleep in the next room served as a constant reminder of what Marcus had to lose if his investigation attracted even more dangerous attention from Castellano's organization. But it also represented what he was fighting to protect. The idea that criminal organizations could operate with impunity in neighborhoods where children played and families tried to build safe, stable lives was fundamentally incompatible with everything Marcus had sacrificed to defend during his military service. The construction noise that had originally motivated Marcus's investigation now seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to the larger issues that his research had uncovered. But he realized that the systematic violations of community standards and regulations had been early indicators of much more serious problems. The disrespect for legal requirements and community concerns had been symptoms of an organization that viewed itself as being above the law and beyond the reach of normal accountability mechanisms. Marcus spent the remainder of the night organizing his research and developing plans for how to proceed with his investigation, while protecting his family from the escalating threats that his inquiries had attracted. The evidence he had gathered needed to reach people who had both the authority and the integrity to take appropriate action against Castellano's organization. But identifying such individuals within a system that had been compromised by corruption would require careful analysis and strategic thinking. The sound of construction machinery starting up before dawn confirmed that Castellano's people were intensifying their excavation activities, possibly in response to the increased scrutiny that Marcus's investigation had brought to their operation. The urgency of their activities suggested that they were either close to finding whatever they were searching for, or that they were concerned about law enforcement attention that might force them to abandon the project before completing their objectives. As the sun began to rise over Maplewood Heights, Marcus realized that his quiet suburban neighborhood had become the center of a conflict that would ultimately determine whether criminal organizations could operate with impunity in American communities, or whether citizens with military training and moral courage would stand up to protect the values and institutions that made civilized society possible. The stakes had escalated far beyond construction noise and permit violations, and the outcome would affect not just his family, but potentially countless other families throughout the region who were vulnerable to similar criminal enterprises. The morning news reports contained no mention of the surveillance activities that had frightened Mrs. Chen or the escalating tensions surrounding the Maplewood Heights construction project, confirming Marcus's suspicion that Castellano's organization had sufficient influence within local media outlets to control the narrative surrounding their activities. The absence of public awareness about what was happening in their community meant that residents remained vulnerable to threats they didn't even know existed, and that normal democratic processes for addressing community concerns had been effectively neutralized by corruption and intimidation. Marcus's investigation had reached a critical juncture where continuing would require him to accept significant personal risks while potentially exposing his daughter to dangers that no child should have to face. But abandoning his pursuit of the truth would mean allowing criminal organizations to operate without accountability in the community where he was trying to raise his daughter. The choice would define not just his own character, but the kind of world he was leaving for Sarah and all the other children who deserved to grow up in neighborhoods where justice and the rule of law provided protection against those who would exploit the innocent for personal gain. 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rodriguez sat in his Pentagon office reviewing classified intelligence reports when his secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything he thought. He knew about his sister's disappearance 3 years earlier. The message contained photographs, audio recordings, and detailed documentation that had been anonymously uploaded to a military intelligence database, along with a brief note indicating that the materials were connected to ongoing criminal activities in Maplewood Heights, involving the property where 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez had vanished without a trace. Michael had spent the 3 years since Emma's disappearance channeling his grief and rage into his work as a senior military intelligence officer specializing in domestic terrorism and organized crime networks that threatened national security. His position within the Pentagon's most sensitive counterintelligence operations had given him access to resources and information that civilian law enforcement agencies could only dream of. But he had been forced to maintain professional distance from his sister's case to avoid conflicts of interest that might compromise official investigations. The anonymous intelligence package that had arrived on his secure server contained evidence that suggested Emma's disappearance was connected to organized crime activities involving buried assets, political corruption, and systematic intimidation of community members who had attempted to investigate irregularities in construction projects. Throughout the region, the level of detail and professional quality of the documentation indicated that whoever had compiled the intelligence had military or law enforcement training, and the specific focus on the Maplewood Heights construction project suggested someone with direct knowledge of the activities taking place at the former Rodriguez family property. Michael's hands trembled as he reviewed photographs showing excavation work that extended far deeper than any legitimate construction project would require, along with audio recordings of conversations between construction personnel that referenced recovery operations and asset retrieval rather than community center development. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of criminal organizations using legitimate construction projects as cover for activities that potentially included the systematic looting of assets that had been buried by previous generations of organized crime families. The intelligence reports in Michael's possession contained information about Vincent Castellano that had never been made available to local law enforcement agencies, including details about his connections to organized crime families, his history of using construction projects to facilitate criminal activities, and his pattern of corrupting local officials to avoid prosecution for activities that should have resulted in federal charges. The scope of Castellano's operations extended far beyond Maplewood Heights, encompassing a network of shell companies, political relationships, and criminal enterprises that represented a significant threat to national security. Michael's military training had taught him to recognize the kind of systematic corruption that enabled organized crime networks to operate with impunity, while legitimate citizens were intimidated into silence by threats against their families and livelihoods. The intelligence package he had received contained evidence of exactly this kind of corruption, including documentation of bribes paid to city officials, threats made against community members who had raised concerns about construction irregularities, and surveillance activities designed to identify and neutralize potential sources of resistance to criminal operations. The anonymous source who had compiled the intelligence package had demonstrated remarkable skill in gathering evidence while avoiding detection by Castellano's security apparatus, suggesting someone with professional training in surveillance and counterintelligence techniques. The methodical approach to documentation and the strategic timing of the intelligence delivery indicated that the source understood the importance of providing evidence to someone with both the authority and the resources to take effective action against a criminal organization that had corrupted local institutions. Michael's position within the Pentagon's counterintelligence division gave him access to resources that included federal task forces specializing in organized crime, FBI units, focused on public corruption, and military intelligence assets that could be deployed against domestic threats to national security. The evidence contained in the anonymous intelligence package provided the foundation for initiating investigations that could ultimately dismantle Castellano's entire criminal network while potentially solving Emma's disappearance and bringing closure to a case that had haunted his family for 3 years. The connection between Emma's disappearance and the current construction activities at the former Rodriguez property was not immediately clear from the intelligence materials, but Michael's experience with criminal psychology suggested that organized crime figures like Castellano would not hesitate to eliminate witnesses or obstacles that threatened their operations. The timing of Emma's disappearance, occurring just months before the property was sold to shell companies connected to Castellano's organization, suggested that her presence at the site might have interfered with preliminary reconnaissance activities. Related to the asset recovery operation, Michael began making secure phone calls to contacts within federal law enforcement agencies, providing carefully sanitized versions of the intelligence he had received while protecting the identity of his anonymous source. The evidence of organized crime activities, political corruption, and threats against military veterans provided federal agencies with justification for initiating investigations that could bypass the local officials who had been compromised by Castellano's influence and corruption. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force expressed immediate interest in the intelligence package, particularly the evidence of systematic corruption involving city officials and the use of construction projects to facilitate criminal activities. The patterns documented in the Maplewood Heights case matched intelligence from other jurisdictions where similar operations had been suspected but never proven, suggesting that Castellano's organization was part of a larger network of criminal enterprises that posed a significant threat to communities throughout the region. Michael's contacts within the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network confirmed that the shell companies associated with the Maplewood Heights project had attracted attention from federal investigators tracking suspicious financial transactions related to money laundering and asset recovery operations. The intelligence package provided crucial evidence linking these financial irregularities to specific criminal activities and identifying key individuals within the organization responsible for coordinating the illegal operations. The systematic nature of the evidence compilation suggested that Michael's anonymous source had been conducting surveillance and intelligence gathering activities for an extended period, possibly months, while carefully avoiding detection by Castellano's security apparatus. The professional quality of the documentation and the strategic timing of its delivery indicated someone with military or intelligence training who understood the importance of building a comprehensive case before taking action against a well-resourced criminal organization. Michael's analysis of the intelligence materials revealed that Castellano's organization had been planning the Maplewood Heights operation for years, conducting research into the property's history, identifying the original burial sites of criminal assets, and systematically corrupting local officials to ensure that their excavation activities could proceed without interference from law enforcement. agencies. The level of planning and coordination required for such an operation indicated a criminal enterprise with significant resources and sophisticated operational capabilities. The evidence of threats made against military veterans and their families provided Michael with additional motivation to ensure that federal resources were brought to bear against Castellanos' organization, since attacks on military personnel and their dependents were considered matters of national security that warranted the full attention of federal counterintelligence agencies. The systematic intimidation of community members who had raised legitimate concerns about construction irregularities represented exactly the kind of domestic terrorism that Michael's Pentagon unit was designed to combat. Michael's secure communications with federal law enforcement agencies resulted in the immediate deployment of surveillance assets to monitor Castellanos' activities, while federal investigators began the process of building criminal cases against key members of his organization. The intelligence package provided by his anonymous source had given federal agencies the foundation they needed to initiate investigations that could ultimately result in federal charges for organized crime, public corruption, money laundering, and potentially murder if evidence could be developed connecting Castellanos' organization to Emma's disappearance. The coordination between military intelligence and federal law enforcement agencies represented exactly the kind of interagency cooperation that was necessary to combat organized crime networks that had corrupted local institutions and intimidated legitimate citizens into silence. Michael's position within the Pentagon's counterintelligence apparatus provided him with the authority to ensure that federal resources were deployed effectively against a criminal organization that posed a significant threat to national security and community safety. As federal agencies began implementing surveillance and investigation protocols based on the intelligence package Michael had received, he realized that his anonymous source had provided him with something far more valuable than evidence of criminal activities. They had given him the opportunity to seek justice for Emma's disappearance while protecting other families from the kind of tragedy that had devastated his own. The systematic corruption and criminal activities documented in the intelligence materials represented a threat not just to individual communities, but to the fundamental principles of justice and accountability that made civilized society possible. The federal investigation that would ultimately grow out of Michael's intelligence package would involve dozens of agents, multiple federal agencies, and resources that dwarfed anything that local law enforcement could deploy against Castellanos' organization. The anonymous source who had compiled the evidence had effectively triggered a federal response that would bring the full weight of the United States government to bear against a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for far too long. Michael's military oath had included a commitment to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and Castellanos' organization represented exactly the kind of domestic threat that undermined the foundations of American democracy through corruption, intimidation, and violence. The intelligence package he had received provided him with the opportunity to fulfill that oath, while potentially bringing closure to the most painful chapter in his family's history, and he intended to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that justice was finally served. As federal agencies began mobilizing resources for what would become one of the largest organized crime investigations in the region's history, Michael knew that his anonymous source had set in motion events that would ultimately determine whether criminal organizations could continue to operate with impunity in American communities, or whether the combined forces of military intelligence and federal law enforcement would prove capable of protecting innocent families from those who would exploit them for personal gain. The story of courage, determination, And the pursuit of justice that began with a veteran's complaint about construction noise was about to enter its most dramatic phase as federal agencies prepared to confront a criminal organization that had underestimated the power of military training, family loyalty, and the American commitment to ensuring that no one is above the law. If this incredible story of justice and redemption has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that prove the power of persistence and courage in the face of overwhelming odds.